Hello everyone, and welcome to the digital streaming edition of Patterns Lie and Other Useful Sewing Facts, presented by And Sewing is Half the Battle, presented by 1/3 of And Sewing is Half the Battle, because we're all in different houses, because lockdown. But hey, we're going to have a good time anyway. Thank you for joining us in our streaming digital world. Normally this is a 2-hour presentation. However, we're going to be condensing it a little bit today to fit within our time parameters. Also, nobody wants to stare at the wall of my sewing room for 2 hours, myself included. So we are going to be covering some basic sewing information. This panel is geared toward people who are novices in costuming, people who maybe want to start making their own costumes but haven't done a lot of garment sewing, maybe people who haven't done any sewing at all, or maybe you don't care about costumes and you just want to learn to make things. That's cool too. So whatever reason you're here, we're going to help you out. And we're going to be talking about how to read a pattern, how to modify a pattern, how to make a mock-up, how to choose your fabrics, how to finish your seams, that sort of thing. So without further ado, let's get started. So obviously the first step in cosplaying or beginning to cosplay is choose what character you want to cosplay. You can choose any character out there, whether it's from a movie, TV show, video game, book, whatever you want to do. Pick a character you like, because you will need the motivation to push through and really work on this costume. If it's a character you're sort of ambivalent about, when things go wrong with your sewing, and they will, they always do. I've been cosplaying for almost 2 decades, and things still go wrong with every single costume I make. When you get frustrated, if you don't have that attachment to that costume or that character, you won't be motivated to push through that frustration and keep working. So I strongly recommend pick a character you really care about or you really want to cosplay. Also think about your personal skill level and what resources you need to complete this costume. If it's a very elaborate costume that's going to require a lot of fabric, a lot of accessories, a wig, props, think about, do you have the resources necessary to complete that costume as you want to complete it right now? For example, if you really love Belle, the Disney Princess Belle, and you think, oh, it would be the best thing in the world to cosplay Belle because she's my favorite character and I love books and that's my favorite movie that I grew up watching. That's great. Do that character. But maybe your very first sewing project shouldn't be the yellow ball gown. Maybe your first sewing project could be something simpler like her village costume. This also goes for the time investment you need. If the con is next week and you're just starting on an elaborate costume, don't pull all-nighters for 7 days in a row to try to get it done. You're not going to enjoy it. It's also not good for your health. And there's no wrong answer about what costume to choose. Ultimately, you get to make that decision. If you say, you know what, this is the one costume I really want to cosplay, I don't care about anything else, and I'm going to do everything it takes to make that costume, go for it. Good for you. Do it. If you're a little nervous about it, that's fine. Everybody is when they start. Speaking as someone who's entirely self-taught, I never had a sewing class. I came in cold and learned everything by trial and error. I know where you're coming from. And some of the costumes I learned the most on were the ones that challenged me in terms of my skills. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. The third costume I ever made was this crazy elaborate iridescent ball gown with jewels and sparkly bits and floating things. I made a decent attempt. It was not the best work I've ever done now, but it was really good for seeing somebody who almost failed home ec. So, hey, do what you want to do. So once you've chosen your costume, you figured out what character you're going to do and what you want to cosplay and which version of it, next you want to assemble as many reference pictures as you can so you can see that costume from as many angles as possible. Unfortunately, some costumes you only ever see from the front or certain angles in a movie, so it can be a little challenging, but get your DVD in your computer and screen cap as many things as you can, or find every comic panel where that costume shows up, or go online and find somebody who's ripped the video game model and done a 360 around the T-pose so you can see all the details. Whatever it is you're working from, get as many references as you can, because that's going to help you choose a pattern, which is the next step in starting your costume. So keep in mind, when you're looking for a pattern, every single piece of clothing, every costume, every garment is made up of a basic number of constituent parts. In the case of a shirt like the one I'm wearing, it's a simple t-shirt. It's got a front, a back, 2 sleeves, and a piece of ribbing around the collar. It's very simple, not a lot of pieces to cut out if you were making something like this. The more fitted your costume is, the more it's going to have seams curving in toward the body or multiple pieces to pull that fabric in. Think of clothing like a 3-dimensional puzzle. You have all these flat pieces that somehow have to geometrically go together at the edges to make a garment that fits to your body, however it's supposed to fit, whether it's very loose, very tight. For women's clothing, a lot of them have special curved seams to pull it in around the waist or the bust. The men's clothing, especially pants, you'll see a lot of pleats or darts at the waist to pull it in so it's fitted over the waist and hips. All of those things go into clothing. But the most important thing is to match the seams so that your pieces of your costume match the type of design you're going for. Now, the easiest way to match your seams, if you can find a reference image that shows the seams of your costume, take your pattern envelope, flip it over, and on the back there are these diagrams down at the bottom that show line drawings of how it's put together. Almost every commercial pattern will have this, unless it's a really specialized pattern of some kind that just expects you to know. Look at the lines. The dark solid lines on this part of the pattern will show you where the seams are. Now, some costume designers and some animators, illustrators, artists, whoever's working on the project you're cosplaying from, they're actually nice and they include the seams in the costumes. This isn't always possible. Sometimes the costumes can't exist in real life because seams would not go together that way, and you just have to be creative and put something together yourself. But in the case of many standard articles of clothing, like jackets, pants, shirts, things that people wear in real life, the seams are always going to be more or less in the same place because there are only so many ways that piece of clothing can go together. So, for example, I've picked out one really common cosplay example that about 15 years ago, everybody and their kid brother was wearing this costume at cons. And this is Roy Mustang from Fullmetal Alchemist. The animators actually included where the seams are in this character turnaround, and I've highlighted them in red here so you can see them a little better. This helps you identify what type of pattern to use because the seams are very straight. The clothing is very boxy. There are no curves here. Everything just hangs very straight and square on the body, which means your seams are going to be very square and straight, kind of like a box of fabric hanging around you. Now you look at this pattern and you see certain elements that pop out at you. It's got that flap that comes across the front and sits at an angle. It's got a long skirt that's actually a separate piece. We call it the butt cape. That's what we nicknamed it when we were making a bunch of them. It's got cuffs. It's got all these details. The details are less important than the seams. And one of the things that a lot of cosplayers ran into when they first started making these is they saw this Civil War replica pattern sitting on the shelf or in the drawer at Joann, and they thought, oh, it's got the flap across the front. It's a military uniform. This will work great. But think back to what we just said about the straight seams. If you look at the straight seams on this costume, and then you compare it to the seams on this military uniform, you'll see where it doesn't really work. The military uniform, the Civil War uniform, has these curved seams in back, these princess seams is what they're called, and that pulls the fabric in to hug the body more. It's also what's called a fiddleback, which has the angled shoulder seams, which you can see up here somewhere. And that also fits differently over the shoulder. It has a different type of front flap where it's vertical instead of crossing the body. The sleeves are actually two-part sleeves, so they puff up at the top and then they have a front and a back and they're cut on a curve. It's difficult to tell from this picture, but you can see that back seam on the sleeve would not be visible if it were a single piece sleeve. So while it looks at a superficial level similar from the front, structurally this pattern's not going to work really well for this costume. It's going to take so much work to modify that it's not going to be worthwhile. You'll practically have to redraft the pattern to get rid of the curved seams and the fitted parts and all of that. Now, when you look at this pattern, this is a women's jacket pattern. It doesn't really look anything at all in detail like the military uniform patterns. But when you look at the seam diagrams, you can see, oh, it's got a single vertical seam up the back. It's not super fitted. I can probably straighten out those side seams pretty easily. The sleeves are one piece and fairly straight. It has a mandarin collar, which means I don't have to do a lot of redrafting. I can just make that collar taller and fold it over for the military jacket. This pattern is actually a lot closer structurally to the Fullmetal Alchemist design than the military pattern that looks more like it from the front. So from the seam perspective, I can modify this pattern a lot more easily to make what I want. And this is, in fact, the pattern we used. Unfortunately, it's out of print. It's one of my favorite patterns. I've used it a zillion times. And you know, I have to get rid of the bust darts for crossplay, but apart from that, it actually works really well for a lot of costumes because it's a very simple square straight coat. So again, the most important thing about choosing a pattern to make your costume is to match the seams, match the basic structure, the basic shape. You can change details. You can add cuffs. You can make sleeves longer or shorter. You can make the collar stand up or lie flat. Those things are much easier to do than redrafting the entire pattern to make it match the fit of that costume that you're trying to match. Now, once you figured out which pattern to use, the next step is to figure out which size pattern to buy. This is where things get really fun. And by fun, I mean you have to do a lot of math. Pattern sizes, garment sewing pattern sizes, are numbered on a completely different system than fashion clothing sizes. So for men, it doesn't really matter because men can walk in and say, oh, I need a 36 waist and a 32 inseam and good to go. You can pull it off the rack and leave. Women, no, we're like, what's a size 2 in this brand and why is it bigger than the size 10 in that brand? Fashion sizes, I don't get it. Pattern sizes run on a different system. They were related to fashion sizes about a century ago. Then the fashion industry happened and now we just have arbitrary numbers. So when you are looking at patterns, you need to know what your measurements are so you can find the garment that fits you. Now, something else to keep in mind is the finished garment size is not going to be the same as the measurements of your body. There's such a thing called wearing ease. Wearing ease is a fancy way of saying room for you to move around in it. So depending on the cut of it, you can have more or less room in certain parts of the garment. In this case, if you notice the disparity in these sizes, the body measurements column and the finished garment measurements have a 10-inch difference. So this is going to be a garment that's much looser. It's not going to be very fitted. It's going to be very loose and flowing and open at the waist or at the bust, as opposed to something that's very, very tailored. So when you are checking the pattern size, look at the body measurements and look at the garment measurements if they're printed on the envelope, which almost all commercial patterns have these on the back. Now, it's important to take accurate measurements of your body. I'm not going to tell you how to do that because there are many, many tutorials online that show you with really nifty diagrams. This is exactly where the tape goes. This is how to bend your arm. This is what you do. And there are even free sizing charts that you can download to fill in your measurements and calculate things. And all of that is available on the internet for free. So use your Google Foo and get that. Now, do keep in mind, cosplayers frequently do crossplay or do other costumes that require them to change their body shape because we're trying to look like a specific character who maybe doesn't look like us in real life. So always take measurements over the types of undergarments you're going to be wearing with this particular costume. For example, I do a lot of crossplay. Obviously, I'm built kind of like a girl in real life, but if I'm doing a masculine crossplay, I wear a binder to flatten myself down and smooth out my silhouette so I have a more masculine silhouette for those costumes. I need to take different measurements for if I'm playing a feminine character who has curves versus a masculine character who does not have curves. There's a significant size difference between the two. So make sure your measurements match what you're wearing under this costume. And every so often you may need to update your measurements because people change size, you gain weight, you lose weight, the holidays happen, whatever. So make sure you're working with a current set of measurements over the types of undergarments you're wearing for this particular costume. Now let's talk a little bit about patterns and how to read them. So if you pick up a pattern in a store, it has a picture on the front. Sometimes that picture has multiple views, is what they're called. A view is which garment you're making. It's kind of a weird word for it, but if I have a pattern that has a jacket and pants, the jacket may be view A and the pants may be view B. That's what that means. If you flip it over on the back, there will be a number somewhere on the back of it. The pattern number is a reference number for how to find that pattern in the catalog of that company. Doesn't really matter, it's just identifying. You will have a garment diagram, which I mentioned before. That's what shows your seams. You will have a list of recommended fabrics, what to make this particular garment out of. I'm going to talk about fabric a little more in a few minutes, but this is useful to know. Look at it and see if it's the type of fabric that you can use for your costume. There's a size chart, a yardage needed. That's to make the exact sizes that the pattern lists. If you're going to be modifying the pattern, such as adding length to a coat or a skirt, you may need additional fabric. And then there's the finished garment measurements, which is what size the actual garment will be once you're done sewing it. Now, when you open up the pattern, you will see a lot of different pieces of paper. You will have the tissue type paper, which has the pattern actually printed on it that you can cut or trace out. You will also see instructions, and you will also see some diagrams. Now, the diagrams will show you all the different garments you can make from the pattern, the views. It'll also show you a piece guide, which is a numbered list of pattern pieces so you know which pattern piece goes with which garment. Again, if you're making a jacket or pants out of the same pattern, you don't necessarily have to cut out every single pattern piece if you only need the patterns for the pants. So check the piece guide, figure out which pieces you need. Next, think about what changes need to be made to the pattern. This would be something like, hey, this pattern matches really well along the seams, but it's a short-sleeved pattern and I need a long-sleeved coat. Or the coat's the right shape and size, but I need it to be shorter. Those sort of changes you can modify on a traced out version of the pattern, so you don't have to tear up your original pattern. These are some of the ways that you may want to modify. Length is a really easy one to deal with. Most patterns have markings on them to indicate where it's safe to lengthen or shorten. You generally don't want to just throw some extra length on the pattern at the bottom because the shape of the pattern will be changed. But they will have a lengthen or shorten line, which looks like this. And that's where you would cut your traced out pattern, add some length, and it's not going to dramatically change the way the pieces go together. Just make sure you're adding the same amount of length on every pattern piece that you have to lengthen. Otherwise you'll have one really long pant leg and one really short one. Also think about fullness. Fullness is how much fabric there is surrounding your body. So a really tight fitted pencil skirt is going to be not very full at all, whereas a circle skirt, or think of a 50s poodle skirt, is very full. There's a lot of fabric to move around. This also applies to things like coat tails or coat skirts. How much flare is there? If you're making Neo's coat from the Matrix, that's a very full coat. I think it's more than a full circle of fabric going around him. There's a lot of movement there. If you're making something more like a military uniform, they generally conserve fabric and they don't have a lot of fullness. There are exceptions, but most of them are very crisp and close to the body. Think about details like the collar. Does the collar need to be taller or shorter or gone? Does the collar have big points that stick out? And this is where you're going to be adding or modifying those elements. Remember, the pattern is just your basic beginning how to put it together. You can always change the details. The small details are very easy to change. What you don't want to get caught doing is having to redo a lot of the seams, but everything outside of that, the length of a sleeve, the length of a skirt, those things are really easy to modify. So start with a pattern that matches the seams as best you can, and then go crazy with everything else. This pattern, I believe I mentioned, this is one of my favorite patterns. I use it for everything. These are a few of the costumes that I have made out of this pattern. All of these costumes have the details changed, the length, the color, the cuffs, the flaps, all of those things, but the seams are still basically the same. All I did was add some extra fabric or take some fabric away to make it more appropriate to what I wanted to use it for. Now, if you need to modify a pattern and change the seams, make sure you watch out for curves. Curved seams are the parts that shape it to your body. So if you change those seams, you may change the way your garment actually fits around you. They are the most difficult parts to modify, and they generally require the most experimentation and trial and error. So rather than cutting up your original pattern, what I would strongly encourage you to do is get some cheap newsprint or tracing paper or tissue paper and make a copy of the pattern, trace it out on another piece of paper, do all of your changes to that paper version so that if it gets completely screwed up, you can always go back to the original pattern and you have the clean original pattern that hasn't been damaged. Now, if you are adding material to a pattern, you're making something longer, you're making something wider, make sure you're calculating seam allowance as well. Seam allowance, again, is that part of the fabric that gets pulled into the seam to hold your garments together. Standard seam allowance for most American garments is 5/8 inch. If you were sewing in metric, it's 15 millimeter. That's mostly for people who have Husqvarna Viking sewing machines because they come in metric. If you're combining pieces from two different patterns, for example, let's say you're using the bodice from one jacket, but the sleeve from another jacket because it matches better, make sure that you trace the top of the sleeve and the arm side from the same pattern. The arm side is the hole your sleeve goes through. That's the technical name for it. It's a sleeve hole. So the sleeve hole, the part your sleeve fits into, needs to be from the same pattern as your sleeve. Otherwise, it won't work. Sleeves are very tricky little beasties. They have their own special kind of geometry. Just trust me, make sure your sleeve and your sleeve hole are from the same pattern. Just trace it onto the other bodice. Now, once you have your entire pattern modified the way you want, the next step is to make a mock-up. Mock-ups are sometimes called muslins because they're usually made out of cheap fabric like muslin. And it's basically a test run. I'm going to make this in a fabric and try it on my body and see if, oops, I forgot to include a hole for my arm to go into. There are a lot of different ways you can do this. This is muslin. Muslin is an inexpensive white fabric, usually white or natural, that you can buy at fabric stores. It's used a lot in things like quilting, and it works really well. It's usually a natural fiber, and it doesn't stretch, so it's very accurate if you need to make a mock-up. However, I've noticed that muslin prices have gone up in recent years, and it gets kind of expensive if you're buying a lot of muslin just to make mock-ups. So what I do instead is I go to thrift stores and buy bed sheets. As long as they're not stretchy, they work just as well. So this is a mock-up I made for the skirt of a big old ball gown I made a couple years ago. As you can see, I have great taste in bed sheets. All different patterns go together. Now, one advantage of making a mock-up, especially out of a light-colored fabric, such as muslin or a light-colored bed sheet, is you can make all your markings and modifications to that mock-up and then use that as your final pattern. So I'll get a cheap bed sheet, I'll cut it up, make my mock-up out of it, put it on my body, and then say, oh gosh, this actually needs to be 2 inches lower, or this part is too narrow, I need to widen it. And then I'll rip apart the mock-up, which you can, if you baste it together with really big stitches, it's really easy to take apart again. You can cut, you can mark on it, whatever. When I've got the mock-up to the point where I'm happy with it, then I'll take apart the mock-up and use those pattern pieces as my final pattern for my final fabric. So I don't have to keep retracing my original pattern, recutting, remodifying. I just use the mock-up as the pattern. Make sure that it's ironed so it's really flat and smooth, because if you've got a lot of wrinkles where it's pulling the fabric in, it's going to be very difficult to trace that and cut it on your final fabric. And speaking of fabric, now we can talk about fabric choice. Fabric selection is critical to how your costume comes out. There are many, many different types of fabric, and it is sometimes very difficult to know which one to use. And you also have to think about things like budgetary concerns. The equipment you're working with. Is this a really finicky fabric that I have to have special equipment for? But the first thing is to walk into a fabric store and figure out what your options are. So I strongly recommend taking a flash camera. If you have an old school digital camera that has a flash on it, perfect. But even if it's just your cell phone, take something with a bright flash and take flash photos of every fabric you're considering. The reason for that is some fabrics don't photograph true. This is especially true of blue and green dyes. A flash photo is going to reflect a different color on some fabrics than what it looks like under whatever fluorescent lighting is in your local fabric store. And you don't want to make your costume, put all the effort into it, wear it to a con, get photos back after the con and say, wow, I thought that was blue, but now it's sort of a greenish purple color. Weird. And be disappointed with your photos. Also, the surface texture of different fabrics will reflect light differently. So, for example, if you want to make something silver and you say, oh, this is the right color, and then you find out it's this super, super shiny costume satin that when you put it on your body is going to make really awkward bulges and reflections in all the places you don't want, and it looks really unflattering, Flash will also help you identify those. Another thing, and something I strongly recommend, especially for certain types of costumes, put your hand behind the fabric and take a flash photo and see if you can see your hand. Some fabrics, especially shiny ones, the light from a flash will penetrate through the fabric, hit whatever's underneath, and reflect back out, and the camera will pick up that light as opposed to the surface texture. I once got photos back of me in costumes, and you couldn't see the costume, all you could see was my underwear. It was really embarrassing. So make sure that you flash test your fabric. That's a big thing. If you're ordering online, I know a lot of places don't have a big selection of fabric stores, my city included, so I order a lot of my fabrics online. Always order a test swatch first. Yes, it takes a little longer. Yes, it may cost you a couple bucks. It is so worth it. Rather than buying several yards of fabric that turns out to be totally the wrong texture or color when you get it, or turns out to be very delicate and it tears when you wear it. Get a test swatch, murder the test swatch, pull on it, shred it, see if it frays, see if it stains, try to iron it, see if it melts, do everything you need to do to the test swatch, and then buy your fabric. Also, if you can, if it's possible, handle a large piece of each fabric you're considering buying. Obviously, that's more difficult with online, but you can still do it somewhat with a swatch. But pick up each piece of fabric, feel it, try to stretch it. If you have a swatch, try to tear it. Don't go into the fabric store and try to shred the fabric, but put pressure on it. See if it tears under pressure. See if it stretches out of shape under pressure. Also think about, how does the fabric drape? Does it flow very nicely? Like, for example, this is a wool suiting. You wouldn't think wool is a very drapey fabric, but it's all about how it's woven. So this is a nice suiting with a really beautiful drape. This would make a very nice cape fabric, something like that. And it's a very sturdy fabric because it's a nice dense wool weave, so high quality. So that would work really well for a dramatic coat that has a big flaring skirt on it. If I want to make something that's a little bit stiffer, this is taffeta. Taffeta is a very stiff fabric. This is what I use for something like my Sailor Moon skirts, fuku skirts, anything that needs to have some stiff ruffles or stiff texture to it. I also use this fabric to make pirate coats, Golden Age of piracy, something where it's got a very full skirt and you need it to have a lot of body. It doesn't drape near as well because it's very stiff and holds its shape. Really good for things like ruffles. However, if you notice, I don't know how well you can see, this particular taffeta, which is a polyester taffeta, has a really high gloss to it. So it's not something I'd want to make a full body outfit out of because, again, the light's going to highlight all the things I don't necessarily want highlighted. So think about that when you're choosing your fabric. Another thing about taffeta, it makes that annoying taffeta creakly sound. Some people can't stand that. If you can't stand that sound, don't make your costumes out of taffeta. Another thing to think about in terms of your fabric choice is, do you need to iron this fabric? Natural fibers, which I generally like natural fibers a lot, like cotton, it lets your skin breathe, it's better for the environment than synthetics. Lots of reasons to use cotton. However, if you're doing a really elaborate costume that is going to be a bear to get on an ironing board and you won't be able to travel with it without crumpling it up in a suitcase and wrinkling it, cotton needs to be ironed pretty much every time you pull it out to wear it. So there are some costumes that it might be better to not make out of a natural fiber that's going to wrinkle a lot, or at least a different weave of natural fiber, like a twill is less likely to wrinkle than a broadcloth, for example. Test it. The best way I've found to test whether or not you need to iron a fabric, grab a fistful of it and squeeze as hard as you can for just a few seconds, and then pull it out, and you can see almost immediately, oh hey, I've got a little fist-shaped bunch of wrinkles here. If they don't smooth out immediately when you rub your finger over it, this is a fabric you're going to need to iron every time. And do please iron your costumes before you wear them. It makes them look a lot better. It makes them look a lot more better constructed, professional, nice costumes, as opposed to, this looks like a pillowcase I slept on last night and now it's got wrinkles all over it. Also think about the appearance of the fabric. This is things like color. Is it the right color for your costume, or is it a fabric that can be dyed? Now, there are a lot of fabric dyes on the market. Some of them work really well, some of them work less well. Natural fibers like cotton or linen are going to dye a lot better and a lot easier and more accurately than synthetic fibers. There are synthetic fabric dyes, but getting exactly the color you need can be kind of tricky because the chemistry of changing the color of a plastic is very different than changing the color of a natural fiber like cotton. Also think about the surface texture. I mentioned before, shiny, shiny, shiny satin's not necessarily your best friend. So if you say, wow, I really need a silver satin, but this one is not going to work, maybe you can look at a matte satin, like a bridal satin, which is what this is. This is a nice matte satin. It's still got a little bit of gloss to it. It looks very elegant, but it's not going to light up your flash cameras like crazy. One other thing I like to do when I'm shopping for fabric, if the fabric store will let you, do not just go in and run out the door with a bolt of fabric because you'll be arrested. But if you ask an employee and they say it's okay, look at the fabric under the fluorescent lights in the store and then walk just outside the door and hold it in sunlight and see what it looks like in sunlight. Because you're going to be passing through different lighting conditions at a convention or wherever you're going. And sometimes fabric that looks one way under a certain kind of light might look totally different under another kind of light. So consider that as well. Now, things to avoid when shopping for fabric. First of all, I mentioned shiny. Anything that is super high gloss reflective is going to be more difficult to make look good. It's not that you can't use it. It's appropriate for some costumes. But in general, let's say you want to make a dramatic ball gown. If it's shiny, every little wrinkle is going to show. Every little bulge is going to show. Every little bit of dirt is going to show. As opposed to using a matte fabric or something with less gloss is going to look a little better. Fabrics that are not intended for garment construction, like lining fabric, broadcloth, quilting cotton. You can get a lot of really cool looking materials. They have really cool prints, they have really cool textures, but they're going to fall apart because they're not meant to be under strain. If you make a pair of pants out of quilting cotton, you might get one wearing out of them before the seam rips out. They're just not designed for that. Anything that is sold for Halloween costumes, like this is Halloween costume satin. It is really kind of terrible, as you can see, not very durable. Generally speaking, I say if it has costume on the label, don't buy it, but there are exceptions to that. Obviously, if you live in a city with a theater district that has theatrical supplies, costume fabric sold for theaters is not the same thing as Halloween costume fabric. It's going to be higher quality. If you have a line that's branded for costuming or cosplay, like Yaya Han's cosplay fabrics, those are higher quality than the cheap Halloween costumes. So it's not that you can't use those if they're sold for cosplay. It's just that you want to test them. Make sure that whatever fabric it is you're looking at, make sure it's high quality enough to hold together. If you put a seam in it and then you have to bend over, you don't want that seam to just rip out because the fabric's not strong enough to hold it. Another thing to think about is care of the fabric. That is things like, how do you wash it? There are fabrics, especially upholstery fabrics, that cannot get wet. There are fabrics that will actually break down if they get saturated with water or other fluids. So if it's dry clean only, it's going to get really expensive to maintain that costume. If it is very sensitive to moisture, probably don't want to make your costume out of it, because at some point you might have to go out in the rain and that, or wash your costume. Either one, that would be bad. Please make your costumes washable. Please wash your costumes. Now, I mentioned before, most pattern envelopes include a recommended list of fabrics on the back of the envelope. And that's a really good guideline. It's a good starting point for choosing your fabrics. It tells you what fabrics the pattern is designed to work best with. So if you're kind of waffling between a lighter weight fabric or a heavier weight fabric, you look at the back of the pattern envelope and it says, make this out of denim, you're going to know that's a heavier weight fabric pattern. The pattern will also tell you how much fabric you need for the pattern as it exists in the envelope. I'm going to suggest always buying a little extra, especially if you're modifying anything, because that way if something goes wrong or if there's a flaw in your fabric. I've bought fabric where I unrolled the section of the bolt I bought and there was a tear in the middle or a hole or a section where the printing went wrong if it's a printed fabric. And you want to be able to work around that and have some flexibility. So I usually try to get a little bit of extra if it's available. If you are adding anything to your pattern, for example, if you're lengthening a garment, obviously you'll need more fabric. So you'll need to do some math and calculate how much additional fabric you'll need. Now, one other thing to consider is if you're buying a fabric that's a very specific color, like a specific shade of blue or red, getting extra is a really good idea so that if you need extra, you have something from the same dye lot. Fabric is dyed in large quantities, but if one bolt was from one dye lot and another bolt was from another dye lot at the same factory, the colors may not be exact. And I've run into situations where something went wrong with a specific piece. I go back and buy another half yard. I bring it home, and even though it's the same fabric and the same code number, they're very different shades of red. So you may need to buy a little extra just to have a buffer. Use a coupon, get it on sale, whatever, but make sure you're getting as much fabric as you need from the same bolt and not just hoping that they have it in stock when you go back. It's important to pre-wash your fabric. That means run it through a load in the washing machine before you start cutting anything out of it. And the reason for that is most fabric, commercial fabric, contains sizing, which is sort of a glue-like material from the manufacturing process that will change the texture. So after it's washed, it'll handle a little differently than before it's washed, which is why when you get a bolt of fabric, it can sometimes feel a little stiff or crisp, and then after you wash it, it gets very soft. That's why. Fabric fibers may also loosen up or shrink, especially natural fibers like cotton. After you wash and dry it, it's going to be a smaller piece of fabric. You obviously want the shrinkage to happen before you cut your pattern pieces out of it, not after, so pre-wash and dry your fabric. Always follow manufacturer instructions for your fabric care. What I do is I just snap a digital photo with my phone of the end of the bolt in the fabric store so I know exactly what it's made out of and how to care for it. And also I have the code number should I need to order more of it. This happens more often than I'd like to admit. Another material you might need to use in your sewing is interfacing. Interfacing is sort of a structural assistant. It backs up the fabric and keeps it from stretching or sagging, and it provides some structural support for certain elements like collars or waistbands that need to remain stiff. The two main types are fusible or sew-in. Fusible interfacing has an iron-on thermal adhesive on the back, so you can just iron it directly to your fabric and it sticks. Sew-in interfacing, as the name suggests, you sew it in. You sew it to your fabric piece. Both of them are useful. They're used in different things. Usually your pattern should tell you which kind you need. Keep in mind that your interfacing, if you're using fusible, every time you iron it, you may reactivate that adhesive. So you do have to be careful when ironing not to wrinkle anything inside your fabric. Now, interfacing comes in a lot of different weights. I'm holding a super light interfacing here. This one's very light and flexible. And this one is a little stiffer. As you can see, it's more like a paper texture. And there are lots of different applications, but if your pattern says use featherweight interfacing or use shirtweight interfacing, use that kind of interfacing. Don't go with something heavier because it will change the way the fabric moves and it may be too stiff. Now we're going to talk about laying out your pattern for cutting. So the most important thing when you lay out your fabric is to make sure that you have a straight grain line that you can follow with your pattern pieces. When fabric is manufactured, there are two sets of threads. There are the warp threads, which are the long threads that run through the entire bolt of fabric, and those are the strongest part of the fabric. And then there are the weft threads that are woven back and forth through the warp threads to make the actual fabric. The weft threads are not as strong because they're shorter and they don't go the whole length of the bolt. The grain line follows the strong warp threads that go the whole length of the bolt. So the way to find your grain line is to find your selvage, which is the manufactured edge of the fabric. Sometimes it has little loose threads, sometimes it has little holes along the edge from the manufacturing process. The selvage is parallel to the grain line. So when you lay out your fabric, if it's folded in the middle, make sure your edges are lined up straight, and if you smooth it totally out flat on the table, there shouldn't be any rolling at the fold, there should be no wrinkles, it needs to lie completely flat, completely straight. Keep in mind that fabric store employees frequently do not cut the ends totally straight, so it's normal to have, when your fabric is folded over, if your selvages are lined up, the manufactured edge of the fabric is lined up, sometimes the cut edge is not straight. That's because people are human and they make mistakes. So make sure that your selvages, your manufactured edges of the fabric, are lined up and straight. And when you see the grain line symbol, which looks like this, the grain line symbol on your pattern pieces must be parallel to the selvage. Otherwise, your clothing won't hang straight. So if you are trying to squeeze an extra pattern piece in and you twist it just slightly so it's slightly off the grain line to make a little more room so you can save fabric, when you put that garment together, the fabric is always going to want to hang along that grain line because that's the strongest threads in the fabric, and it'll twist. It'll hang crooked. So if you've ever bought a cheap pair of pants and one leg kept twisting around and wasn't hanging right with the other leg, that's why it was cut off the grain. So find your selvage, lay out your fabric smooth and flat on a flat surface. Make sure you have a clear table. Kitchen tables, dining room tables work really well for this. If you have one of those giant cutting mats, those are also great. You can even cut on the floor. Just find a really smooth, large, clean area of floor, preferably not on carpet, and lay out your fabric that way. Have a large area to work with. Next, you want to arrange your pattern pieces on your fabric. Now, most patterns will have a cutting layout listed somewhere in the pattern, usually in the front part of the pattern instructions. Take note of the width of the fabric that they're listing. The standard fabric widths are 60 inches or 45 inches. If it's showing you a pattern layout for a 60-inch piece of fabric and you only have 45-inch wide piece of fabric, obviously your layout's going to have to change. So you might need to do some experimentation. So when you're laying out your pattern pieces for cutting on the fabric, the first thing to remember is grain line. It's very important. I'm going to keep saying that. Grain line is critical. The second thing is if your fabric itself has any sort of directional texture, a directional nap like velvet where all the fibers have to lay the same way, or if it has a print that has a clear top and bottom, make sure the tops of your pattern pieces all point the same way and the bottoms point the same way so that you don't end up with pictures upside down. So I just grabbed this out of my fabric stash. This fun Star Trek comic fabric, all the pictures go up and down the same direction. If I laid out all of my pattern pieces and then I flipped one upside down, when I put that garment together, one piece is going to be backwards. It's going to look wrong. So make sure that if your fabric has a direction, you note that so you have the right one. Obviously, if you're using, say, a solid color fabric where it doesn't matter which way you turn it, it's going to look the same. That doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about it. And you can actually save a little space by flipping a pattern piece upside down. That's fine. You also want to make sure that you mark all the pattern markings onto your fabric somehow. This means if there are notches, if there are darts, if there are circles that you have to line up, if there's any sort of pattern marking on the pattern piece, it has to be copied over to the fabric. Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this. If you have a bunch of different colored straight pins, you could have a system that you know that you say all the yellow straight pins are darts, all the black straight pins are circles. You can do it that way. I find that that tends to be a little less accurate and sometimes pins fall out, so I don't like to do it that way. So what I do instead is use fabric marking pens and pencils. Fabric marking pencil is basically chalk in pencil form, where you just write on it like a pencil and it shows up on your fabric. It's really good for darker fabrics because you can get these in blue, pink, or white. For lighter fabrics, sometimes I'll use a disappearing ink marker or a washout ink marker that are designed for that purpose. And you can write or indicate directly on the fabric, and then the ink fades over time or washes out. Another thing to pay attention to is notches. Now, the notches are the markings that show where one pattern piece lines up with another pattern piece for assembly. And they take the form of little triangles, usually, and they can come in 1, 2, 3, 4. Each set is meant to correspond with another set of the same number of triangles. Now, the triangles on your pattern pieces are notched into the fabric, into the pattern piece itself. When I cut my pattern pieces, I prefer to cut the notches outside. So I'm actually making a triangle that goes back to back with the symbol on the pattern. That way I don't accidentally clip too far into the seam allowance and have a spot that could be weakness in the seam if it skips over a spot where the tip of the triangle is. So I personally like to mark them out. Some people don't even cut the notches and they just draw them on the fabric. Whatever works for you, just make sure you have a system. When you pin your paper pattern down to the fabric, so you can either trace around it or cut around it, you need to make sure that you pin through all the layers of the fabric. A lot of times you're going to be pinning through at least 2 layers because you will need a right and left side of your garment, and it's a lot faster to cut out 2 at once than to cut them out separately. But make sure you pin through all layers so that you don't end up with any wrinkling or shifting where one pattern piece might be slightly smaller or larger than the other. Make sure that your pins, when you put them in, do not stick out past the edge of the paper pattern, because when you're cutting, then you might accidentally cut into a pin, which will wreak havoc on your sewing shears. Speaking of sewing shears, let's talk about sewing shears for a second. Sewing shears are sacred. Sewing shears cut only fabric and nothing else. So sewing shears are not like regular scissors. They are sharper. They usually have a bent handle so that they are offset slightly, which makes it easier to cut without lifting the fabric up off your table. And it is very important to keep the blades in good condition, which means they cannot cut paper or plastic or foam or any other materials. If they do, that razor edge of the blade gets dull, and what it does is it crushes the fibers in your fabric, and it can cause damage or runs or uneven edges. And it's a lot easier to cut with sharp shears. It's a lot better for your fabric, especially for delicate fabrics like silks or sheer weaves like organza or chiffon. If you have dull shears, it will actually shred the fabric along the edge, and that's not good. Now, you may have noticed I have a small collection of cutting implements here. This is not all of them. This is the ones I keep on this wall. They all have different purposes, so that's why I have so many of them. Out of all of these things up here that look like shears, the only ones I actually use to cut fabric are these orange ones. And I have one other pair. These are my really nice, my gift to me. These are what I use on specialty fabrics like silks or sheer fabrics because they're very sharp, and the offset handle actually makes it very easy and accurate to cut on a table with great deal of precision. All the other things up here, some of these are for foam, some of these are for paper, and I have my own system, so I know which ones they are, so I don't accidentally cut paper with my sewing shears and then find out they're not as sharp as they need to be. Especially because where I live, we don't have sharpening services. When your sewing shears are dull, you either mail them off somewhere, which gets very expensive very quickly, or you buy a new pair of shears, which gets very expensive very quickly. So I try to take good care of my shears. All that to say, make sure your shears are sharp when you're cutting out your pattern pieces. Make sure you're not accidentally using the really dull paper scissors when you're cutting out your pattern pieces. It does make a difference in how easy it is to cut out with accuracy, especially cutting little details like the notches, or if you have a small corner that you have to really work in and get there. It's important to make sure you have good shears. And if you don't have really good dedicated sewing shears, test whatever you're cutting with and make sure it's not going to damage your fabric. Test a scrap or something, and cut as accurately and cleanly as possible, because it really helps. Okay, now that you've cut out your pattern pieces, you will need to match your notches together and pin everything together so you can stitch it. Notches always get matched first. So if you cut out your pattern piece and you have a section with 2 notches here and another pattern piece with 2 notches here, match up those double notches, pin them first, and then go out and pin the rest of the side. If you have darts or gathers or stay stitching or anything like that that has to be done before you pin your pattern piece together, read your directions. Make sure you know about those things before you sew your pattern piece together. Stay stitching is a special type of, it's basically a longer based type stitch that goes on curved parts that might stretch otherwise. So I talked about the warp threads and the weft threads. The 45-degree angle cross that goes between those two is called the bias, and that's the part of the fabric that has some natural stretch to it. Any part of your pattern edge that cuts across the bias, for example, on a collar, you're going to be cutting on a curve, and at some point right around here, you're going to hit that 45-degree mark. If you don't reinforce that, then your fabric can actually stretch along that bias, and it means your collar won't fit right because you've now stretched it out of shape. So stay stitching is done before you assemble the entire garment, and it just helps hold everything in place so it doesn't stretch out of place. It's really common in things like collars, waistbands, curved pockets, anything that might have that kind of extra pressure on the fabric at that point. And it's very easy to do. It's just a small line of stitching. You don't take it out, it just stays in the garment. But it needs to be done before you assemble the rest of the garment. So do check the directions and make sure that you know about those beforehand. The same thing goes for darts, especially around waistband or bust in women's clothing. There are frequently darts where you pinch a triangle of fabric together and stitch it to pull it in so it shapes around the body a little more. And those need to be done before you assemble other pattern pieces. And anything that you're not sure about how to do, if it says to gather something or to ease something, feel free to Google those terms and look for a tutorial. Easing in particular is a pain. It was years before I knew how to ease properly. I was just sort of faking it by manually smushing the fabric together and putting a bunch of pins in it. So easing is what you do if you have two pattern pieces that need to line up. For example, if you have a princess seam is that curved seam that runs around the body to pull fabric in and shape it, especially around the bust or over the shoulder blades. If you have one of those seams and one side of the pattern piece is slightly longer than the other for fit reasons, it will say ease these pieces together. Well, you're already dealing with two weirdly shaped curves that are running in different directions. It's difficult to pin those things. What easing is it swooshes, that's a technical term, swooshes one side of the pattern piece to be slightly smaller so that it fits evenly with the other one. You can do this a couple of different ways. The technically correct way to do it is to run multiple lines of stitching along the edge with a loose baste type stitch, like you were going to gather it into a little ruffle, except you don't want to gather it that much. You're going to hold one of the threads, not both threads, one of the threads on one end, and just smush slightly all along to pull the fabric together, kind of like, think of a curtain rod with rings, and you're just moving the whole curtain so it occupies a slightly smaller percentage of the space, but not pushing it all the way over. Anyway, that's easing. There are lots of tutorials online. When I started sewing, YouTube didn't exist. I'm old enough that YouTube did not exist when I started sewing. So I was trying to figure this stuff out, and there weren't a lot of resources easily accessible with tutorials. And so I was using a totally different method that was basically difficult and wrong for many years until I figured out the right way to do it. So Google anything you don't know how to do that's in the directions. Absolutely. Use the tutorials that are out on the internet, and you can find a lot of help that way. So back to pinning. When you are pinning your pieces together, it's important that you pin them on a flat surface lying with the fabric supported and not hanging down where its weight can stretch it out of shape. So that means you're using a table, you lay out one pattern piece, and then you take the other pattern piece, lay it on top, and pin them together along the edge. You are not picking them up off the table and holding them as you put the pins in. The reason for this is it's very difficult to keep the fabric from stretching or twisting or creating puckers, even very minute ones that don't show up until you're actually stitching it, unless it's on a flat surface. So as much as you might want to like put on your favorite movie and sit on the couch and pin stuff, resist the urge. Put on an audiobook instead and lay it on a table, because you really do need that fabric supported to make sure that all the edges go together as neatly and as evenly as possible. When I pin my pattern pieces, I prefer to put the pins in perpendicular to the edge so that when I'm stitching, I can just grab the head of the pin, pull it out, and drop it on a pin cushion as I go, rather than trying to stitch over the pins. It's possible to stitch over the pins, but there is a risk of hitting the pin with a needle if you're not careful, and that can either break your needle, break the pin, or both, and it jams up your machine. And it's just not good for the machine mechanics to be stopped suddenly by your needle hitting a piece of metal. So I tend to pull mine out as I go, unless I'm doing something that has really deep ruffling and I need the pins there, in which case I just sew very, very, very slowly, and I'm very careful. So now your pattern pieces are pinned together and you're ready to start sewing. This is either the fun part or the scary part, depending on your experience level. Yes, it can be both. Sometimes your sewing machines are finicky. Sometimes sewing machines hate you and it's personal. Sometimes sewing machines just do their best to intimidate you. like this. This is the actual stitching guide from one of my sewing machines, and it took me a really long time to figure out what those pictures meant. They're just like symbols everywhere. What even is that? So when I started sewing, I didn't have a sewing machine. As I've mentioned before, I did not have any formal training. I was self-taught and learned by a lot of trial and error. And my first sewing machine that I bought myself was a little manual portable model, which worked very well. It's a great little workhorse. I love it. But it did not have any fancy settings, and it only had a handful of stitches. And then I won a really, really nice sewing machine in a costume contest at ASEN, actually. And it sat there staring at me, terrifying me for a very long time because I didn't know how to use it. And it was like computerized. The machine's smarter than I am. What the heck? What is this thing? So now I'm really happy with it, and I'm very grateful to have won it. So I felt very honored, but it was a learning curve. So if you don't have a lot of sewing experience, or you're using a machine you're not really familiar with, it's okay. You'll get there. But you do need to learn about a few basic stitches and what they're used for. The basic stitches you need to know are a straight stitch, which is your standard stitching. It's used for holding garments together. A basting stitch, which is a very loose stitch that you can do by lengthening your stitch length with the stitch length button or dial on your machine. Also, sometimes you may want to change your thread tension so that one side is a little looser than other. That's mostly important for things like gathering. A zigzag stitch, this is used for holding down trim, also used for stretch fabric. So if you need a seam to stretch, a zigzag stitch will allow the fabric to have some give. If you use a straight stitch on stretch fabric, this thread will break whenever the fabric stretches. There's also a specialty stretch stitch that some machines have, not all, and it's similar to the zigzag, it's just a little different shape. Either one of those is fine for stretch fabric. These are the things you need to know how to do before you start actually sewing. First, know how to thread your sewing machine properly and adjust the thread tension properly. This is something that's usually explained step by step in the manual. A lot of the most common sewing machines, there are tutorials online. You can watch somebody walk you through a tutorial. Just know how the thread works. Make sure you can thread it properly so that nothing's snagging or breaking. Know how to load and change out a bobbin. Different machines have different bobbin mechanisms. They also take different size bobbins, so make sure you're working with something that works with your machine. Make sure you can adjust the stitch length and stitch direction. Most of those things are going to be delineated clearly in the manual. If your machine did not come with a manual because it was secondhand or you inherited it or whatever, get online, put the model and manufacturer into Google, and most sewing machines have the manuals available somewhere. Either somebody has archived one, they've scanned one in. I've seen sewing machine manuals from the 50s and 60s that people have scanned in case you have an older machine, or anything, the last 20 years they're all available as PDFs from the manufacturer website, so they're pretty easy to find. Sewing machines vary dramatically. They're much like cars where, yes, they all have a steering wheel, they all have a pedal, but where they put the windshield wipers and the cruise control and whatever else could be anywhere, and exactly how you use them could vary dramatically. Some of them have onboard navigation and computer systems that are smarter than you are too. So once you know basic handling and maintenance on your sewing machine, you can start stitching your costume together. Always begin and end stitching with the needle in the highest position. That's important for structural reasons with your sewing machine. If you have an automated or computerized machine, it's usually bright enough to do that for you. If you're using a manual machine, which is the vast majority of machines, then you need to turn the hand wheel on the side of the machine to raise the needle all the way up before you start and end sewing. The reason for that is the highest position is the only point at which the thread can actually move freely through the machine without breaking or snagging, because the gearing is designed that way. So if you finish sewing your seam, take your fabric out and try to pull it out so the thread can be cut and you can actually get it out of the machine. If you haven't raised the needle all the way up, it'll jam and break the thread and you have to rethread everything, and sometimes it can damage your gearing. It's just a pain. So if your machine does it for you, great. If your machine doesn't do it for you, when you stop stitching, just turn the hand crank until the needle comes all the way up. It's important to turn the wheel so the needle goes forward through a stitch sequence rather than backwards. So if you stop sewing and it's halfway down, rather than turning it and backing it up, turn it through a complete additional stitch, and that'll raise the needle up and it won't screw up your gearing of the thread or anything else. It just has to do with the way the thread feeds through the machine. On your sewing machine stitch plate, there will be a mark showing the standard seam allowance. In imperial units, this is 5/8 of an inch, and there will usually be a line showing where the 5/8 of an inch mark is. That's the standard seam allowance in America. If you're using a metric one, it's 15 millimeters. Use that guideline for most of your seam allowance, and don't skimp on seam allowance. You need that much fabric for a reason. There are occasional patterns where you will need more seam allowance, and those will be clearly marked, such as some dress pants especially will say, oh, use a 2-inch seam allowance here, or use this much seam allowance on the hem of the pants. And then you can follow pattern guidelines for that particular part of the seam. But for the most part, you always want to use your standard 5/8 inch or 15 millimeter seam allowance. There are a lot of different needle types. Most of them don't matter to you until you're doing specialty stitching. The universal needle will work with almost all standard woven fabrics. The important thing is that you trade out your needle and keep it sharp, because needles can wear down very quickly, especially with certain types of fabric. A dull needle can snag your threads in your fabric and cause runs. Dull needles can also hit things and break, and pieces of needle can fly out of your machine and hit you in the face. Ask me how I know this. So make sure you're trading out your needles regularly. The general rule of thumb is every time you start a new project, change your needle. Or if you're sewing a lot of leather, vinyl, really heavy-duty fabrics, and you can tell that it's just having trouble punching through, you're going to need to change them out more quickly because they wear down more quickly. Another thing that's very important for your garment fit and appearance is to press out your seams flat as you go. This makes the seam a little sturdier and straighter. It means you won't have any bunching or puckering. It makes your garment hang better because there's not a lot of puffiness to it. There's not extra fabric inside. So the way you do this is you take that seam that you've put together, butterfly open the seam allowance, and then press it out. So you end up ironing everything flat. For really tight areas like sleeves, you can use something like a sleeve board, which is this little doodad back here. I got this one for $10 from a local, like Craigslist type listing. You can find them a lot of places cheap, or you can make your own by making a cotton tube and stuffing it with polyfill. That works too. But you can lay your garment on or slide this part into the sleeve and iron it flat that way, and that gives you a nice crisp seam on the inside of the sleeve without creasing the outside of the sleeve with the iron. Once you've butterflied your seam allowances open, you need to finish them so they don't unravel inside the garment. Now this can be done a number of different ways. You can use pinking shears to trim the edges so that they don't unravel. Pinking shears are these objects. They actually have a zigzag. I don't know if I can get that close enough for you to see. There we go. They have zigzag blades. You can see a little bit. And when you cut the fabric, they end up with this type of texture. That zigzag texture means you're cutting across the bias instead of along the straight threads of the weave, and it keeps it from unraveling, so you don't end up with weird fraying threads and puffy bits of fabric inside your garment. It also means your seams are a little more secure because they're not going to unravel down to the stitching. So that's one option. It's very simple. Just go along with pinking shears and trim off the edges of all your seam allowance. If you've got a garment that's going to be washed very frequently, though, you still want something a little more sturdy holding that together. Or if you have a garment like a jacket or a coat that's going to be worn open and there's no lining to hide the seam allowances, the pinking shear method doesn't look really neat if your garment's hanging open. It still shows. So you can finish your seams a couple of other ways. If you have access to a serger is a specialized type of sewing machine that trims off the edge and then uses what's called an overlock stitch to wrap the edge in threads so it holds everything together very nicely. You can also do an enclosed seam. An enclosed seam would be something like a French seam or a flat felled seam. There are tutorials online on how to do those. There are options as well. Basically, it just seals the raw edges inside and stitches over them so they can't unravel. You can also do a bias tape enclosed seam. This is a really good decorative seam covering. So again, if you have a coat or something that's going to be hanging open, that doesn't have a lining, covering the insides with bias tape, you can even do a contrast color and have it look like stripes on the inside, and it looks very snazzy. I've seen a lot of commercial garments do that. Your hems likewise need to be finished so there are no raw edges and there's no thread that can come unraveled and hang down under the edge of your garment. There are a couple of easy ways to do this. One is to turn up your hems, where you fold it up once and then fold up again so the raw edge is inside a tube, and then you stitch that down. Then it can't unravel. That's probably the easiest way to do it. You can also do a rolled hem, which is basically the same thing as a turned hem, only much, much smaller, and you can use a presser foot to do that. There's a special rolled hem presser foot that will turn those edges under for you. It's especially good on very sheer or delicate or lightweight fabrics because it turns and makes a little tiny tube with stitching over it. Again, you can also serge those edges and then turn them up and stitch them so that you have a nice enclosed edge on the bottom. Probably when I'm judging costume contests, the number one novice mistake I see is not finishing the hems properly. So try one of those options. Make sure that you get those edges really nicely contained. Otherwise, every time you wash the costume, you're going to have to go along and trim all the loose threads, and it'll be kind of a pain. So that's a very high altitude overview of beginning sewing, how to choose a costume, choose a pattern, do some modifications, lay out your patterns, pin them together, and stitch them. I know there was a lot of material I sort of skimmed over, but I think you're probably all smart people and can Google any of those terms you didn't quite grasp. And of course, if you have any questions, you are welcome to contact me at andsewingishalfthebattle.com or any of our social media. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you're having a wonderful stay-at-home con season, and I look forward to seeing you all in costume when we get back to normal. Thanks. Stay safe.